Well, it's the world's most profitable company, but for now, Saudi Aramco's riches will stay in the family. While the country's energy minister has denied reports it's cancelled Aramco's IPO, he didn't say when it might happen. Khalid Al-Fali said the government remained committed to the Aramco listing, but that it would be, quote, at a time of its own choosing when conditions are optimum. The kingdom first announced IPO plans in 2016 when oil prices were low. They're part of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's drive to wean the kingdom off the oil that's made it wealthy. Officials had initially said the listing would go ahead this year, but priorities have shifted and oil prices have since recovered. So they've pushed back the date to at least 2019. Fali said the company will instead focus on buying a stake in chemicals company SABIC from the country's sovereign wealth fund over the next few months. Well, let's get more on this now from Ellen Wald in Jacksonville, Florida. She's an energy expert and president of Transversal Consulting. She also wrote the book Saudi Inc. and she's currently a non-resident scholar at the Arabia Foundation. Welcome to the program. Firstly, as we heard there, Saudi Arabia has been forced to deny those reports in Reuters that it's cancelled Aramco's IPO altogether. What do you think is the real story here?
I think the real story is that the IPO, the company is ready financially for the IPO. They've done all of the due diligence, they've prepared their financials. They're basically waiting for a political decision at this point, and that's not really forthcoming. So essentially, they're in a holding pattern right now. Meanwhile, they've decided or they've been pressed by the Saudi government to go ahead with this acquisition of SABIC. The acquisition of SABIC makes sense for Aramco. It's looking to expand its downstream business. SABIC is a major company, but the question is just how much debt is Saudi Aramco going to take on in order to complete this transaction?
Yes, and on that question of debt, there's a report in the Financial Times suggesting that Saudi Arabia is turning to international banks to lend it up to $12 billion to help finance the Crown Prince's, I guess, ambitious economic vision. So if that is true and Saudi Arabia does need up to $12 billion, why is it then delaying this IPO of Aramco, which would bring it, hundreds of billions of dollars potentially?
So there's a difference between going and taking on debt to fund, say, the Saudi budget and taking on debt to fund the public investment funds investments in tech companies. And so Saudi Arabia has taken on debt to fund its budget before. That's not really a problem for the company. It has a good credit rating, can give good interest rates. It's not a problem. The question is, why is a sovereign wealth fund, which could be funded with state money, going to take loans in order to make investments in what are really fairly risky companies? And that to me is a very difficult issue, maybe a troubling sign for the health of Saudi Arabia's economic diversification. The Aramco IPO, had they transferred the Aramco shares to the PIF and then sold about 5%, would possibly have generated about $100 billion if they got that top valuation, which is in the entire scope of a sovereign wealth fund, not all that much money. I mean, Norway's sovereign wealth fund is upwards of $1 trillion. The Saudis are looking to have $2 to $3 trillion. So it all is very curious, and it makes investors kind of wonder, where is this all headed?
Yes, and as you say, Saudi officials had hoped that Aramco would attract a valuation of somewhere between $2 and $2.5 trillion. Some analysts have reduced that figure. But in terms of whether or not the evaluation will go ahead, do you think it'll happen?
I think that from a financial perspective, it could very well happen. From a political perspective, it's really hard to say. It really, at this point, depends on who's making the decision. And right now, they've got a lot of competing interests at play. They've got the Aramco executives. They've got different government ministries, all of whom have different perspectives and are competing interests potentially. Ultimately, it will be the king and the crown prince who make that decision. The decision to kind of wait and see, I see as maybe a more measured decision. It did seem like they were maybe rushing into things. Khalid Al-Fali has said they're ready to do it, but they're waiting for the optimum time. I'm not so sure there will ever be an optimum time for an IPO of this scale. They may just have to bite the bullet and do it if they want to, but it's not something that you can just rush.
No, that's right. Very much a wait and see scenario. Ellen Wald, fascinating to get your thoughts. Thank you.